Hi, we continue in Genesis 39 and complete the chapter today as the wife of Potiphar has used her pair of stories to convince the men of the house and the Lord of the house, her husband, that Joseph has attempted to have sex with her, although we never heard from the men of the house whether they bought into her story or not. But we know Mr. Potiphar became enraged and put Joseph in the prison, as you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 20. So as we enter into just these few verses here, what I want to look at is how tightly parallel these final verses are, you can see on the right side of the screen, with the first verses. The context is very different. He was at the top, in a sense, here at the beginning, and he's at the bottom here, as indicated by the vertical placement on the screen here. But that's just a coincidence. What matters is that Yahweh is with him either way, and Yahweh is only with him in these two places, anywhere in the entire story. So we have to look at both what's happening here and how this sets an idea before us that God is with Joseph, and many scholars and many readers assume that throughout, but it only says so here. It's the impression that we get at the beginning of something that carries with us. And it's a very powerful rhetorical exercise to do that, but we have to pay attention to that so we don't assume what the story doesn't tell us later. So we've been looking at how throughout this situation Joseph has found himself beset all around, and that's not surprising. First by his brothers and now by Mrs. Potiphar, and yet he finds himself in this situation. So let's begin to look at our story, and there's some details that you can see on the right side in the translation that are lost here, not least of which is master for Lord, which I've been translating throughout the Hebrew Adon, which when it refers to Yahweh is Adonai as Lord, so not master but Lord, and prison. Literally, it's prison house, and that makes part of the house the issue that we saw, where Joseph was in charge of the house that Potiphar put him in charge of, and the whole scene with Mrs. Potiphar was in and out of the house, and the people are in the house. So this continues that by he's just in a different house. Instead of being in Potiphar's house, he's in the prison house. And there are a couple of other details we need to look at. He didn't take him, he gave him. Or literally here it's he gave him. He did take him and then gave him into the prison. So it doesn't have hands there as it does for many other examples of hands, as you can see below, including what's in Joseph's hand here twice. But it's he gave him into the prison. So he's giving up his control of him and putting him in the control of somebody else. And that's what we're going to hear in just a moment. So the prison house, Bayit HaSohar here. Bayit is a house, of course, and as Westerman notes, a technical term used only in this story. It's that's my note, actually. It's 8 times in this, as we'll see. As he notes, prison was something unknown in Israel until the later monarchy, and we see one example of that in 1 Kings. But it also was unknown in Egypt. Literally, this term means house of roundness, and as Wenham notes, the term suggests it was a fortress that also served as a prison, several of which are known in Egypt. But as my note below from several sources notes, historical evidence suggests Egypt rarely used prisons as punishment, normally providing immediate physical punishments. And that was true throughout much of the ancient world. In the time of Jesus or of Acts, we see Peter put into prison, but prison there was a holding place either for a hearing or to be executed. It's very expensive to put people in prison, and even in Roman prisons, the prisoners' families had to provide food or they would starve to death. We know almost nothing about the context of an Egyptian prison, but we do know there was a famous fortress that's established by the name of the archaeological site Tel Habua, which is on the, quote, Way of Horus, the road between Egypt and Canaan. And I want to highlight that now because that road will be taken many times throughout this story as Jacob experiences the famine and sends Joseph's brothers down to Egypt, and they come back along that road. So it's perhaps along that very road that Joseph is in prison, although we don't know that for sure. You can see it here from Google Maps, where it's just 3 kilometers from today's Suez Canal, although the archaeological site is not shown there. And that's fairly south from the coastal road that you might expect someone to take, but Google Maps doesn't show what was the reality at the time of our story of who was in charge and where cities were important. And the time of our story, of course, I shouldn't necessarily say of course, because if you're jumping here you don't know this, is controverted. The placement of the story within the narrative of Genesis suggests it's the 2nd millennium BCE, and many scholars try to place the story in that context, but it's almost certainly written and promulgated from the time of exile or after, which is 1,000 years later, and so the situation would have been different at that time when the Babylonians reigned powerful throughout the land, throughout the Middle East. So we don't know exactly where this was. And note that throughout this, no specific place in Egypt is being named. Joseph is taken down to Egypt, but Egypt is a big place. And no cities are named here, which is also interesting. This is the first specific place other than Potiphar's house where he is. And it's described using the word for place, makam, 47 times in Genesis, but only here. And in the same context, you can already see down there in verse 3 of the next chapter, that place there. So this is the last place named. And then where the king's prisoners were confined, and I want to bring up the little chart I've made for this video about imprisonment to highlight some of the translation issues. So the word for imprisonment, Hebrew sar here, notice it's somewhat like sar, what Potiphar was, the official royal eunuch, but it's a different word, but it perhaps echoes the sense that someone who's an officer of the king is in a sense imprisoned in power for the king, but that's perhaps also just a coincidence. But in this verse 20, it's used twice, and I didn't translate it as literally as it could because it's really awkward. But it might sound something like, the place where imprisoned were the king's prisoners who were imprisoned. It's there twice. So it's twice in that verse. But then we also see down below, and you can see on the left side of the screen there as well, confined, where it's twice here. The place where Joseph was confined, and now the cupbearer and the baker are confined there as well. And as you may know, spoiler alert here, they're not there for the long term. They're there until they can get their dreams interpreted, and we know what's going to happen to them. If you don't, you'll find out soon enough. Then Joseph will use it in chapter 42 when he's, to the brothers, seems to be the representative of Pharaoh, and he is controlling the food supply and access. He uses prison against them. Do we think of that as perhaps karma, that he's having them experience what he experienced? But he didn't experience imprisonment because of the brothers. He experienced being sold because of the brothers. And that will come up as well as in what he does. So that whether we see what Joseph does later as trying to reproduce in the brothers' experience what he experienced or not, we'll have to decide when we get there. But here it is twice there in chapter 42. Then a little later in chapter 42, we see it again. There are two metaphorical uses for it later. I translated this way, it sounds absurd, but Joseph imprisoned his chariot, literally bound his chariot, and similarly here bound his foal to the vine in a poem at the end. So two metaphorical uses for it, but basically the only uses for it in the entire book of Genesis are for what we're seeing here and in the next scene, and then for what Joseph does to his brothers there. Let's look at the parallels between the beginning and the end before we look up close, and we can see how tightly I'd like to note that these are connected, as opposed to scholars who see these verses as introducing chapter 40, which they also do because that will continue in the site of the prison house, but there are also these very detailed parallels. So as I've already noted, Yahweh is with Joseph only in these places, offering blessing in the beginning and chesed at the end. We can see here as showing steadfast love. I translated it as hesed in my chart because steadfast love is a common way to do it, but it's really untranslatable. It's the very essence of who Yahweh is, showing whether it's called covenant faithfulness, which sounds kind of abstract and impersonal. Steadfast love perhaps gets across a little of the guttural sense of Yahweh's commitment to be with Israel as a whole, and in this case with Joseph. Joseph also is said to found favor in the eyes of both Potiphar and the prison house officer. So that's from their perspective. They're looking good on, looking well on Joseph, and then they give him authority. They put it in his hands. In both places, they put it in his hands, and really over everything, except Potiphar's wife, of course. But the prison house officer puts all the prisoners who are in the prison in his charge. Neither Potiphar nor the prison house officer attend to anything with Joseph there, using the very specific word here, me'uma here, and as you can see from my note below, in 39:6, it's also used in verse 9 and 23, but only a couple of other times there. And then whatever Joseph does, Yahweh makes it prosper, using the same words in verse 2 and 3, and then we see it down here. So what is the text telling us with all these parallels? The most obvious thing is Joseph is being protected. But we also have to recognize who's getting this information, whose perspective this is. We as readers are hearing this, of course, but are any of the characters aware of this? Does Joseph know that Yahweh's with him? If he says so, if he knows so, he never says so. He'll never call upon Yahweh. He'll never use that name. He referred earlier to Elohim, and he will again. So we don't know if Joseph's ever had a direct encounter with Yahweh, but this is the initiative on Yahweh's part. The verbs all apply to Yahweh. Yahweh was with Joseph. Yahweh showed him hesed. Yahweh gave him favor. and then Yahweh made it prosper. So Yahweh's doing all these things in the background, whether Joseph knows about it or not. We saw in the first scene that Potiphar was said to be aware that Yahweh was the force that was making Joseph prosper. But we asked at the time, why would it make sense that an Egyptian eunuch would attribute whatever goodness is flowing out of Joseph to the God of the imprisoned person? That makes no sense at all. Why not Ra or Horus or one of the great powerful Egyptian gods who've given them empire, after all, and put Potiphar in the position he's in? We don't know that, but here the jailer doesn't seem to know anything about it at all. So let's just look at a couple of other details here. The word for care here is literally what we saw for in the hand, so just noting that there. And everything that was done there, he was the one who did it. So the prison house officer is basically abdicating all responsibility and giving it to somebody who Potiphar has put into his hands for insulting his wife. It's really quite the transparent turnaround. The jailer must know why Joseph's there. We don't know why if Joseph meant to be there just for a little while to cool his heels, or whether he's meant to be executed, or what. He's certainly not expecting to be there for a long term. But meanwhile, there's something about him that transfixes the prison house officer, and he puts everything in his charge. That because Yahweh was with him, again, could be something that the chief jailer or the prison house officer I've been referring to it knows, but we don't know that. But in any event, at the end here, the jail is prospering. Everything seems to be going well there. And yet, is Joseph meant to stay in jail? Is prospering in jail what Yahweh or anybody else has in mind for him? It could have been, but of course it's not. And we'll see what happens as the story turns to the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker next. See you then for that.